Have you ever wondered what might be lurking in the shadows of a peaceful campsite? Behind the serenity of nature, there is something sinister, something that many try to forget, but never can. Today, I bring you stories that took place in an apparently ordinary campsite, where what hides among the trees and inside the tents is not just silence, but something far darker. Brace yourself, because these stories are more than just a nightmare. They are real. If you have the courage, stay until the end, because what happens after all of this might be more disturbing than you can imagine. And before you think about leaving, don't forget to subscribe, because on my channel, the terror is just beginning. Mark had always been skeptical when it came to the supernatural. To him, ghost stories and haunted campsites were just legends told by thrill seekers, until the day he decided to test his own courage. Along with a few friends, he went camping in a remote location, far from the well-known trails and the busier areas. They chose a campsite deep in a dense forest, known only to a few, and the isolation seemed like the perfect opportunity to relax. To Mark, the greatest danger was the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot, or maybe a bear, but nothing beyond that. On the first day, everyone was excited. The campsite was set up and the fire began to grow, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. The weather was pleasant and the group started having fun, but something inside Mark told him there was more to this place, something he couldn't quite identify. As night fell, he was the first to notice the silence of the forest. It wasn't just the usual calm of a nighttime campsite. There was a tension in the air, as if all the sounds of nature had been silenced at once. The others were distracted by the fire, but Mark felt an invisible presence watching him. He decided to ignore the feeling and go for a walk. His plan was to explore the area, but the sensation of being observed never left him. After some time walking alone, Mark spotted something peculiar among the trees. An old tent lay on its side, covered in a thick layer of moss and leaves. It looked oddly familiar, but he couldn't understand why. Cautiously, Mark approached. As he got closer, memories started surfacing. He recognized the tent. It was the same model his family used when he was a child, at the same campsite where he had spent many childhood summers. The place where he and his parents had been forced to leave after a tragic event he never wanted to relive. Something terrible had happened in that forest, something he had never been able to fully comprehend. With a growing sense of unease, he examined the tent. The zipper was partially broken, but he managed to open it. Inside, the smell of mold and decay was unmistakable. But what truly unsettled him was that the tent seemed untouched, as if no one had disturbed it for years. The interior was dusty, yet everything was in place. A sleeping bag, a blanket, a backpack. It didn't look abandoned, but rather carefully left behind, as if someone had left in a hurry. Slowly, Mark rummaged through the tent, trying to understand how this was possible. He was certain that as a child, the tent had been left behind. But why was it here now? A thought began forming in his mind. He knew this wasn't just any campsite. What had really happened that distant summer? His memories were vague, but images began to surface. Flashes of a tense night, where the sound of the wind had seemed like a distant voice calling his name. He had never wanted to believe the stories, but now he felt an unbearable weight pressing down on him. Suddenly, his eyes landed on something peculiar in the back of the tent. A journal, a hard-covered notebook, very old. Mark picked it up, his fingers brushing against the dust-covered cover. He opened one of the pages, and what he found made his blood run cold. The entries were written in a frantic, almost desperate handwriting. But what terrified him most was the date. It was the same year as the tragedy, 15 years ago. And even more disturbing, the words in the pages were written as if someone had been forced to record their final experiences. The sentences repeated themselves, as if they had been written by someone on the brink of insanity. They are watching us. They don't want us to leave. They know who we are. A shiver ran down Mark's spine. He flipped through the pages, desperate to understand what was happening. But with each turn, the content grew more disturbing. It spoke of an invisible presence, something that inhabited the campsite and never let those who entered leave unscathed. It mentioned voices calling people's names at night, voices that seemed to come from inside the trees, and that those who ventured out to investigate never returned. Mark was about to close the journal when something made him stop. A page had been marked with a red X. His eyes widened as he read, "If you find this journal, run. The campsite is cursed. They will come for you." Before he could react, a noise came from within the forest. A low, deep sound, as if something was dragging itself through the dry leaves. Mark froze. His friends weren't far, and he knew this wasn't normal. He looked around, but saw nothing. The darkness was thick, as if the forest was swallowing everything around him. Then he heard a friend's voice calling his name a second time. He turned quickly, but when he looked toward the source of the sound, there was no one there. That's when he heard it again, this time clearer and closer. "Mark ... The voice was soft but carried an eerie urgency. When Mark turned back, the figure appeared, a tall, skeletal shadow that seemed to materialize from the very trees. Its eyes were hollow voids, empty and deep, as if nothing existed beyond the darkness. Its body was wrapped in a dark mist, and its limbs looked elongated, almost distorted. The shadow didn't move like a person, but as if it was part of the forest itself, flowing in an unnatural, unsettling way. Mark tried to scream, but his voice failed. He couldn't move, and then, before he could run, the figure whispered his name. "Mark ... He turned to flee, but his feet wouldn't move. The ground beneath him felt like it had turned to mud, trapping him in a nightmare. The forest's sounds grew louder, but all he could hear was the whisper, his name echoing through the darkness. He finally managed to take a step, then another, but terror paralyzed him again. The silhouette was approaching slowly, and Mark felt a crushing pressure on his chest, as if he was being pulled towards something he could never escape. When he finally managed to let out a scream, it was the sound of his friends rushing toward him that made the shadow vanish. But as Mark turned to speak to them, he was completely alone. The others were gone, and the tent where the journal had been was no longer there. Nothing remained. The forest was silent, as if nothing had ever happened. But Mark knew. He was no longer in the world he once knew. The campsite had absorbed him, and now he was part of what he had feared the most. Sarah had always been an adventurer. She loved exploring abandoned places, locations no one else dared to visit. When she heard about a forgotten camp in the mountains, known only as Camp Grayson, she didn't think twice before organizing an expedition with her friends. They were young, full of energy, and no challenge seemed too great. But Sarah knew that fate had a peculiar way of playing with people, and she had no idea just how far it would take her. Camp Grayson was a remote place, hidden among the trees, and accessible only by a trail that many considered too dangerous. To her, that only added to the appeal. When they arrived at the camp, they were surprised by its state of abandonment. The tents were destroyed, the campfires long extinguished, but there was something disturbing in the air. Something Sarah couldn't immediately identify, but she could feel it in her skin. After setting up their own camp, Sarah and her friends began to explore the area. They discovered a small lake surrounded by towering trees, where the water reflected the sky like a mirror. At first glance, the scene was perfect, but soon Sarah noticed something odd. The trees seemed farther apart than normal, as if the lake was a prison, isolating them from the rest of the forest. The sounds of animals were absent, and suddenly a cold breeze blew through, carrying something unseen in the air. "It's getting late. Let's head back to the fire," one of Sarah's friends suggested, but she insisted that there was still more to explore. She wasn't exactly afraid, but something deep inside her warned her to stay away from the lake. Something was wrong. They kept walking until they stumbled upon a small clearing where they found an old book partially buried beneath a pile of dry leaves. The book had a worn leather cover and was tied shut with an old piece of string. Always curious, Sarah untied the cord and opened it. The pages were yellowed, and the ink, though still legible, looked as if it had been smudged by water over the years. But what she read on the first few pages made her heart stop for a moment. "This is Camp Grayson, and it will not be forgotten as long as one of us is alive. The curse of the camp is not a legend, it is real, and all who dare to return will never leave this place." The text was incomplete, cut off mid-sentence, but it was enough to send a chill down Sarah's spine. She didn't know what it meant, but the book clearly hinted at something terrible that had happened there, something that should never be forgotten. She decided to take the book back to their camp to investigate later, but as they walked, an unsettling feeling settled over them. A deep silence took hold, as if all the sounds of the forest had suddenly vanished. Sarah looked around, but saw nothing immediately suspicious. Then a scream pierced the silence. It was one of Sarah's friends, running towards them, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. "There's someone back there!" he shouted, his footsteps pounding against the ground. I saw something move." The others, stunned, asked what he had seen, but he only pointed toward the dense forest. "A figure, a shadow, like someone watching us." Everyone exchanged uneasy glances, trying to understand what was happening. The night was beginning to fall, and the darkness seemed to swallow the clearing. Sarah wanted to ask more, but somehow she already knew he wasn't lying. Something was approaching, something that did not belong in this camp. But what? As the group gathered around the fire, they started hearing noises, at first soft, like twigs snapping underfoot, then louder, like something large moving through the woods. The whispers and murmurs grew in intensity, becoming clearer, like voices calling, inviting. Sarah couldn't understand what was happening, but as the minutes passed, the sensation of being watched became unbearable. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Someone's out there." Her friends nodded, but no one dared step beyond the clearing to check. The darkness now felt alive, a tangible presence surrounding them. But then Sarah looked down at the book again, and something strange happened. The words began to glow with a deep red hue, as if they had been freshly written in blood. She ran her fingers over the pages, trying to make sense of it. Suddenly, the page flipped on its own. It was as if the book had a will of its own. The words that appeared on the new page were the most disturbing of all. "They will come, no matter where you go. You will never leave this place. The camp does not allow the living to leave. Each cycle, a new soul is taken, and the cycle never ends." Panic spread through Sarah, and she dropped the book, which landed on the ground with a dull thud. "What does that mean?" she asked, but no one had an answer. Fear spread through the group like wildfire. They wanted to run, but the trees around the clearing seemed to shift, creating a labyrinth that hadn't existed before. The path back was blocked. There was no escape. Then the figure appeared, a tall, elongated shadow, like something cast by firelight, but with distorted proportions. The air filled with a nauseating stench of rot and something even worse, despair. Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her friends were frozen, unable to move. The figure watched them for a long moment before finally stepping towards Sarah. What happened next was a blur of images. She was dragged into the forest, her body pulled without mercy. The sound of her screams echoed through the night, but none of her friends could reach her. She saw, at the very end, the entrance to an ancient tunnel covered in roots and soil, the last thing she saw before losing consciousness. Sarah woke up hours later, alone in the camp. The tunnel was gone. Her friends were gone. The camp was empty, as if it had never existed. But the book was there again, its pages now filled with new words. You will stay here. The camp never forgets. What Sarah didn't know was that by opening that book, she had unleashed the curse of Grayson. The cycle would never end. She was next to become one of the shadows. Jason had always been a man of science, someone who trusted data over beliefs. His life was built on logic, and everything he saw or experienced needed a rational explanation. When he received an invitation to join a group of friends for a camping trip, he accepted without hesitation. To him, camping was just another experiment, a test of endurance, a break from the routine. He believed that no matter how isolated the place, logic would always prevail. Nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen. The group arrived at the mountain campsite late in the afternoon. The location was perfect, secluded, untouched, as if the outside world didn't exist there. Towering trees surrounded them, their branches swaying with the wind, whispering indistinct words. Jason, ever the skeptic, ignored the eerie atmosphere. He was there to enjoy nature, to challenge any superstitions that might arise among his friends. Nothing would shake him. As night fell, they gathered around the fire, telling camping stories. Laughter and chatter filled the air, but Jason felt something was off. He couldn't pinpoint it at first, but then he realized the forest was too quiet. No insects chirping, no distant hoots from an owl, just silence, a suffocating, unnatural stillness. This is just the calm of nature, he told himself, but the unease lingered. He glanced at his friends, oblivious, lost in their conversations. The tranquility felt wrong, like a fragile illusion waiting to shatter. A cold wind blew, sending shivers down his spine. Needing some space, Jason walked toward the edge of a small river near the camp, hoping to shake off the growing anxiety. The trees swayed more violently now, bending slightly backward, as if recoiling from something unseen. Then it happened. Across the river, something moved. A shadow flickered between the trees, shifting erratically. Jason narrowed his eyes. It was unlike anything he had seen before, floating, formless, yet undeniably present. His breath caught in his throat. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm. No response. The shadow continued its unsettling dance, moving forward and backward, hypnotic in its irregularity. Against all reason, Jason stepped into the river, the icy water soaking through his shoes. He had to see what it was. As he reached the other side, the shadow vanished, dissolving into the darkness of the trees. He looked around, heart pounding, but found nothing. No tracks, no signs of movement. He didn't believe in the supernatural, but this was different. Returning to camp, he tried to dismiss what he had seen, but unease gnawed at him. His friends noticed his pale face. "Jason, you okay?" one of them asked. "Yeah," he lied, forcing a chuckle. "Just tired." Sleep didn't come. Lying in his tent, he stared at the ceiling, body tense. Then a sound, soft at first, barely audible. a whisper. "Jason!" He bolted upright. The voice was faint, yet unmistakable. It called again, coming from the forest. He knew better than to follow, but something, an invisible force, drew him in. Against all logic, he found himself stepping into the darkness. Every step echoed unnaturally, as if the forest itself was hollow. The whisper grew louder, guiding him. Then he saw it. A figure stood among the trees. It was not human. Its glowing amber eyes pierced the darkness, its skeletal frame wrapped in a translucent pale skin. It was neither alive nor dead. Something caught in between. The voice spoke again, but this time it was clear. "You shouldn't be here, Jason." He tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't move. A paralyzing dread gripped him, something deeper than fear. It was as if his very essence was unraveling. "What do you want?" he whispered, voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, the forest began to change. The trees twisted, the sky blackened, and the wind howled like a chorus of the damned. The figure stepped closer, and Jason's body turned ice cold. A hand reached out, pressing against his chest. Agony exploded through him. He felt his soul being pulled, his body burning from the inside. He tried to scream, but darkness consumed him before he could make a sound. The next morning, Jason was gone. His friends searched, calling his name, but he had vanished without a trace. The only sign of his presence was a strange mark on the ground, as if something had dragged him away. They left the campsite that day, never to return. Jason was never found, and the mystery of his last night remained unsolved. Emily never believed in ghost stories or urban legends that circulated among campers. She was always practical and, as a good skeptic, thought that everything was nothing more than superstitions fed by the human mind. When invited by her friends to go camping, she didn't hesitate. To her, it would just be another weekend away from the city, breathing in the fresh mountain air. She had no idea that this camping trip would be different from all the others, not for a single moment. The group arrived at the campsite on a cloudy morning. The trees around them seemed denser than usual, but Emily didn't pay much attention to that. They set up their tents near a stream, a perfect place to relax, but also somewhat isolated. While the rest of the group busied themselves with trivial tasks like making a fire and preparing dinner, Emily wandered off a bit to explore the area. She walked along a narrow trail, cutting through the thick vegetation. As she moved forward, the sound of the stream became more and more distant until it disappeared completely. The silence that took over the forest was unsettling. Emily stopped for a moment, feeling a sudden chill. She looked around and realized that although she was in the middle of nature, everything seemed off. The trees were too close together, as if they had been deliberately planted to create a tight and suffocating corridor. Following the trail, she reached a small clearing. In the center, there was an old wooden house, completely covered in moss and aged by time. The house looked abandoned for many years, yet it had a mysterious aura around it. Emily, always curious, couldn't resist. She approached the creaky door and opened it, her entire body enveloped by a chilling sensation. The house was deserted, except for an old, dust-covered piece of furniture and a pile of yellowed papers in the corner of the room. Emily walked over to the table and, intrigued, picked up one of the papers. It was an old, handwritten letter, seemingly dating back many years. The content was strange, and the tone of the writing carried a deep sense of despair. The words on the page were clearly a plea, a cry for help. "I don't know how much longer I can hold on. They are always watching me. I can't leave. I can't go back. They call me. I don't know who they are, but I can feel their presence. Please do not come after me." The letter was incomplete, and Emily didn't know what to think. She read it several times as if the words were trying to convey something to her. But what? Who was writing? And what was this presence mentioned in the letter? Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room, as if the house were alive. Emily shivered and, unable to explain why, decided to leave immediately. She tried to close the door behind her, but something stopped her. When she turned around, she saw a figure in the window of the house. It was a silhouette, a woman with long, dark hair. She stood still, staring at Emily. Her eyes were deep and empty, lifeless. Emily felt her body freeze. She didn't know what she was seeing, but something in her instincts told her she needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. She turned and ran back along the trail, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the forest's silence. Fear consumed her, and when she looked back, the figure was vanishing. But Emily didn't stop to check. She needed to get back to camp. When she arrived, her friends were worried, noticing the frightened expression on her face. Emily could barely speak, and the only thing she managed to say was, "There's something in that house. Something isn't right." Her friends tried to convince her to forget what she had seen, but Emily couldn't. Something was stopping her from leaving the forest behind. She didn't know what it was, but she could feel the presence of the figure, as if it was watching her every move. That night, the atmosphere at the campsite became more tense. The fire burned low, and the sound of the forest, once calm, now seemed threatening. Emily tried to rest, but the woman's eyes, as if burned into her soul, haunted her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the woman in the window, her empty and desperate expression. Then, in the middle of the night, she heard a distant scream. The sound was deep, as if it came from within the earth. Emily got up from the tent, fear guiding her outside. Her friends were restless, trying to understand what was happening, but the air around the campsite grew heavier and heavier. Suddenly, something moved in the darkness. It was a figure, the same woman Emily had seen in the house. She was there, standing, watching them. Her long hair swayed in the wind, but her eyes remained fixed, and her expression was the same as before, empty and lifeless. The group, paralyzed with fear, tried to move, but the figure seemed to hypnotize them, as if they were being pulled toward her. In a sudden motion, the woman raised one of her hands and, with a slow gesture, indicated for them to follow. Unable to control their own bodies, Emily and her friends began walking toward the figure. Their steps were not their own, as if they were puppets, and the air around them was dense, as if something invisible was holding them in place. When they reached the figure, she smiled. Not a normal smile, but a terrible one, an expression of pure anguish. "You finally understand," she whispered. "Now, it's too late." What happened next was a blur of light and darkness, and Emily woke up the next morning alone in the empty campsite. Her friends had disappeared, and the campsite was completely silent. The only thing left behind was an old letter, similar to the one she had found in the house, now in her hands. The paper had only one sentence written on it: "You are part of the cycle now. There is no return." Zachary never believed in legends. To him, everything had a logical explanation. He was the kind of person who felt more comfortable with science and reason than with superstitions and myths. When his friends invited him to go camping in the mountains, he accepted without hesitation. He didn't care about ghost stories or rumors of unexplained disappearances. He was there to have fun and disconnect from city life. The group arrived at the campsite on a Saturday afternoon. The place was isolated but beautiful. There was a wide clearing surrounded by ancient trees and a small abandoned cabin in the corner, looking like something straight out of a horror movie. But Zachary, being who he was, just glanced at the cabin and laughed. "This place has more history than I expected," he said, but no one paid much attention. That night, everything seemed normal. The group made a fire and started telling stories, trying not to be intimidated by the silence of the forest. But Zachary wasn't in the mood for scary tales, so he stepped away from the circle and walked to the riverbank, where the water flowed gently, reflecting the moonlight. As he watched the movement of the water, he started to feel watched. A chill ran down his spine, but he ignored the sensation. Maybe it was just the exhaustion from the trip. But when he looked closer at the water, he noticed something strange. Reflected on the river's surface, he saw a figure. The figure stood behind him, motionless, just watching him. Zachary turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The river continued to flow serenely, as if nothing had happened. "You're losing it, Zach," he murmured to himself, laughing nervously. But when he looked at the reflection again, the figure reappeared, this time closer. A tall figure with dark hair and piercing eyes. Panic began to creep in, but he tried to stay calm. He stood up abruptly and walked back to the campsite. When he arrived, his friends were laughing and chatting, completely unaware of what he had just seen. "Zach, you look pale. What happened?" one of his friends asked. He looked back toward the river but said nothing. He didn't know what was happening, but an overwhelming sense of dread consumed him. That night, he tried to sleep, but something was wrong. The wind howled and the forest seemed more alive than ever, as if something was moving within the shadows. He could feel that the figure's presence was still there, watching him from somewhere. As the hours passed, Zachary could no longer sleep. The feeling that something was about to happen ate away at him. Then, around 3 a.m, he heard a sound coming from the forest. A muffled but clear sound, as if someone was calling his name. He didn't know what to do. Fear paralyzed him. Unable to resist, he got out of the tent and quietly walked away from the campsite. The forest was denser at that hour, and the darkness was almost impenetrable. He followed the sound until he reached a clearing. And there, suddenly, the figure appeared. Now, closer than ever. Zachary tried to scream, but no sound came out. His feet were glued to the ground, as if an invisible force prevented him from moving. He looked into the figure's eyes, and everything around him started to spin. The fear was so intense that he could no longer breathe. The figure took a step forward, and Zachary felt a deep pain in his chest. It was as if something was draining his life, his energy. "You knew this would happen," the figure whispered, its voice a low hiss. "You were always meant to meet this end." The pain intensified, and Zachary felt himself fading. Before he could understand what was happening, everything went dark. He woke up the next morning, but something was off. The campsite was empty, as if no one had ever been there. There were no signs of his friends, no trace of recent activity, just an unsettling silence. Zachary tried to call out for them, but his voice wouldn't come out. He looked at the river's reflection again, but this time he saw nothing. Everything was eerily still, yet the fear still consumed him, as if he had become a permanent part of that place. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't leave the forest. It was as if he was trapped there, doomed to wander aimlessly. In the end, he realized he was alone. He had become part of the campsite's story, just another victim of whatever lurked in the distance, always waiting for the next lost soul. Jacob was the last to arrive at the camp. He knew nothing about what had happened to the others. He didn't know about the legends or the disappearances, but something drew him to that place. Maybe it was the desire for adventure, maybe the love for the unknown. But when he and his friends arrived, the scenery felt different. The camp, which should have been a peaceful and welcoming place, had a heavy atmosphere, as if the forest was swallowing it whole. Jacob and his group set up their tents in the same area where all the others had camped before. It was an isolated but beautiful spot, offering a view that made them feel like they were on top of the world. However, something was off. The forest around them seemed darker, and the silence was oppressive. There were no sounds of animals, just the sound of the wind passing through the trees. On the first night, While they sat around the campfire, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He felt a growing weight on his shoulders, as if something invisible was there, watching them. But his friends were cheerful, laughing, telling stories and making jokes. They didn't seem to notice the same tension in the air. It was as if nothing could affect them. But as the night went on, Jacob started hearing something, a faint whisper coming from the forest. He stood up and moved away from the group, trying to understand where the sound was coming from. The deeper he went into the forest, the clearer the whisper became. It wasn't a human voice, but something strange and distant, as if it came from somewhere beyond comprehension. He followed the sound until he found an old cabin. The structure was in terrible condition, but something about it called to him. The door was slightly open, and the whisper seemed to come from inside. Jacob, overcome with irresistible curiosity, pushed the door and stepped in. Inside, the smell of mold and rotting wood was overwhelming. The faint moonlight barely illuminated the space, but Jacob saw something that made his heart stop. In the center of the room stood a mirror, old and dusty, but perfectly intact. He cautiously approached and looked at his reflection. At first, he only saw his own face, but then something strange happened. The reflection began to distort, and for a moment he saw the face of someone who wasn't there. It was the figure of a woman with deep, hollow eyes, staring at Jacob with an unsettling intensity. She stood behind him, reflected in the mirror, but when he turned round, no one was there. Panic took over, and he quickly backed away, running out of the cabin and back to the camp. When he arrived, his friends were gathered, but something was different. They were silent, their eyes empty, as if they were in a trance. Jacob tried to call out to them, but his words echoed without response. A chill ran down his spine as he realized something had happened to them. They were no longer there, not as he knew them. Then he looked at the reflection in the river that ran near the camp, and there, once again, he saw the woman. She was smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile, but a cold one, void of any emotion. Jacob took a step back, but the smile remained. He felt the same sense of despair and terror that all the others had felt before him. He was trapped there. He was part of the cycle now. As dawn broke, the camp was deserted. There was no sign of his friends, no trace of any recent activity. Everything was quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. But Jacob knew something was terribly wrong. He tried to leave the forest, but with every step he took, it felt like he was only going deeper. No matter where he looked, the scenery remained the same. The river seemed endless, and the forest had no exit. It was as if he was trapped in a parallel reality, where time stood still, and the disappearances were never explained. He saw the cabin again, the same one from before, and he knew there was no escape. The woman was there, in his mind, watching him, waiting. Jacob looked up at the sky, but he didn't see the sun. He realized that the cycle had been completed. He was no longer a normal person, but part of something much larger, something he would never understand. The presence of the woman was now in his thoughts, in his soul, and he knew that the camp was not just a physical place, but a point of convergence for lost souls. He closed his eyes, hoping the nightmare would end, but there was no escape. As Jacob fell into a deep sleep with no hope of waking up, something began to change. The forest around the camp, which had been so dense and threatening, started to dissipate. No longer were there ancient trees and overwhelming shadows, but a vast plain, illuminated by an unusual light that seemed to come from the sky. And then he woke up, but something wasn't right. He slowly opened his eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin. The sensation was strangely comforting. He was in the same clearing where the camp had been set up, but where were his friends? Where was the cabin? Where were the disappearances and whispers? However, the answer was before him, in something he could never have imagined. Jacob rose, his body weakened, and began to walk through the camp. Each step he took brought him closer to the truth. He turned to the river, and there, in the reflection of the water, he saw his own face. But it wasn't the face he knew. It wasn't that of a normal man. It was a distorted version of himself, with empty eyes, a crooked smile, and the expression of someone who had already lost their humanity. It was at that moment that he understood. He was trapped, but not just physically. He was part of something that transcended life and death. He was a lost soul, doomed to repeat the cycle of disappearances, scares, and horrors that the camp consumed. And the most disturbing truth, the one no one could have imagined, was that the camp had never really existed. Everything Jacob had lived through, the other missing people, the figures, the sensations, was nothing but an illusion, a distorted reflection of his own mind. Every story he had heard about those who disappeared, it was all connected. They were all trapped in the same reality, the same lie. And the woman, the cold and empty smile, she wasn't a victim. She was the guardian of the cycle, the one who kept the camps alive. She was there to ensure no one escaped, to ensure the souls would not be freed. Now, Jacob was part of that game, doomed to be yet another figure that future travelers would encounter in the forest. A reflection in the river, a vision of something that was no longer human. And before he could understand more, the woman appeared again, this time behind him. "Your journey is just beginning," she said, her voice reverberating in his mind, as if 1,000 echoes were saying the same words. "But you will never leave here." Jacob looked at her, his eyes already void of hope, and knew he would never leave that camp. He was already a part of it, and the cycle would repeat for the next ones, for the others, who would arrive not knowing what awaited them. And so, the camp continues, waiting for the next victims. But the question remains, are you ready to face what lies beyond the forest? Or are you already trapped, unaware, watching it all unfold? If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and explore more horror videos, where each story is a new door to the unknown. Don't forget to leave a like and share with your friends. But be careful. The next story could be about you.